UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. Now, what if you woke up one morning and you could see, in inverted commas, demonic creatures flitting around you? Creatures that were hell-bent on tormenting you. What if you believed that you were connected to a fourth dimensional network that no one else could see or hear but was putting messages from God into your life? And what if your faith convinced you that this experience was God's plan for you and those who were working around you were trying to undermine that? Well, what if that reality was actually a psychotic episode as a result of a severe mental illness? How scary would that be? How confusing and conflicting, especially if you have a genuine faith experience in a tradition that acknowledges the truth of principalities and powers. How scary would that be? And how confusing and conflicting if you have a genuine faith experience that believes in principalities and powers. And what if you also had medical understanding that let you know that psychotic illness can let you see that which isn't and believe that which is false? How would you cope with that? Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that there are spiritual forces beyond our ken and that as Christians we battle not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers, as it says in the Bible. But severe, enduring mental ill health is also a real thing. And it is important that we, as the church and as individuals, see the difference and see our role to support those who live with and at times behave out of severe, enduring mental ill health. Whether the episode that they manifest is a spiritual dimension or a belief that leaders are out to get them, or even, as we once experienced in our church, someone who said they weren't coming back to church because church people were breaking into their house and stealing their red tea towel. Because in a delusion, even the trivial is significant. So how do we respond to those living with psychotic illness? Perhaps one way is to bust, well, at least some of the myths and explore the truth. Joining me to help me do that this week is Sharon Hastings. She's a Christian, she qualified as a doctor, and she is someone who lives with schizoaffective disorder. Her books and articles on the reality of living with a severe, enduring mental illness open a window onto a reality that blights people's lives and still carries a lot of stigma, even in a world where we are willing to honour those who are open about their depression, their anxiety, and their therapy. And that's where I'd like to start, Sharon, because when I use that word stigma, is that fair when it comes to psychotic illness?
I think there is. I think particularly in relation to these kind of psychotic illnesses that we've been talking about, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, even bipolar, I think we have done well as a church and society in terms of talking more openly about depression and anxiety, even eating disorders, self-harm in young people. But I think psychosis still carries fear. And by psychosis, I mean that detachment from reality, people who have hallucinations and delusions. There was a recent study done in the UK, and 89% of people with psychotic illness said that they had experienced stigma. And I certainly, in my life, have experienced stigma. And it's a very difficult thing. It's a very isolating thing, and it really doesn't help your self-esteem.
Yeah.
And it's happened to me within the church as well as more widely within society.
So, and is part of the problem with that stigma that we don't understand, and it's probably fair to say that whilst most people will have heard of schizophrenia, will have heard of bipolar disorder, may even have come across the sort of the nuance of schizoaffective disorder and so on, we carry more at the front of our awareness some of the stereotypes and some of the negative stereotypes about, the person that is walking down the road mumbling to themselves in a terrible physical state, or the person who is prone to violent outbursts. That's the sort of stereotype people carry, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think in the media we do hear sometimes that somebody with, say, for example, paranoid schizophrenia has committed a violent crime, and that's what we hear and that's what we take away, when actually a very small percentage, a recent study says about 3%, maybe 5% of violent crimes are committed by someone with mental illness. Whereas it seems like more when we listen, I know it seems like more to me. And actually, people with psychotic illness are very vulnerable to crime and may much more frequently victims of crime. And of course, there's a sort of stereotype of somebody. But actually, I mean, I have psychotic illness, and that's not what I look like, and it's not what most of the people I know who have psychotic illness look like. And I think we just need to sort of, I think the church can take a lead in breaking down stigma, yes, because we are called to love people from all walks of life, and no matter what their life experiences are.
So before we start to talk about some of the different elements of it and bust some of those myths by revealing truth around these sorts of disorders and the reality of psychotic illness, can we talk a little bit about your experience? Because you were just qualifying as a doctor, and it was just a couple of years later that you received your diagnosis. And that went on from your first episode, which, I mean, just reading the words about these images, these almost demonic images that you had around you, I think you called them the tormentors. I'll be honest with you, it unsettled me just reading it on the page. What it must have been like for you actually going through it, I can't begin to imagine. Can you tell us a little bit about what those early days were like for you?
Of course. Now, the psychotic episode, when it emerged, was not the beginning of my struggle with mental illness. I become unwell in my final year at medical school, and I was very low in mood, and I was having some strange thoughts, but whether or not I shared them, I don't really remember, but I was kind of diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And then I managed to graduate, but I was told not to practice at that time because I was unwell. I was then diagnosed after a manic episode with bipolar disorder. And then a year later, I had this psychotic episode whilst my mood was really quite normal. And I was told I had schizoaffective disorder. But how that manifested was in two main ways. So first of all, I had hallucinations, and those for me were primarily visual. It's quite common to have auditory hallucinations and hear voices. And I did hear laughter, but not clear spoken words. So I became aware of shadowy creatures flapping around me. And I kind of called them the tormentors. They looked to me like pterodactyls. They were sort of coming in and out of my peripheral vision, and they were mocking me, and there was laughter. And it was very, very unsettling. The other thing that I was aware of was what I called the evil presence, which was this kind of dark area behind my left shoulder, always the left shoulder, and it was palpable on my shoulder. So that was the kind of hallucination side of it, where I was perceiving things that other people couldn't perceive. The other side of that was the delusions. So I had a very complex system of delusions. I was aware, and this is all inverted commas, I was connected to the fourth dimension. And in the fourth dimension, there were forces that were sending electric impulse messages, and these were coming into my brain. And I believed that I had been chosen, that God had chosen me to receive these, and I was the custodian of these messages. I thought thoughts were being implanted into my brain. I also had the unsettling experience of believing that my thoughts were being broadcast to the world so other people could hear what I was thinking. And then I kind of also got into this way of thinking that there was a conspiracy against me, including my mental health professionals, who were trying to dumb down my experiences with antipsychotics so that I could not pass on the messages I had been chosen to receive. So it was very complicated. There was, as you can imagine, it was quite difficult for me to work with the mental health professionals because I didn't have that trust with them. It was very isolating. Because I was telling people this, and they were saying, "Oh, you're not well. You're not thinking straight, and you need more sleep or whatever." I just wasn't being believed and heard. And
the fact that it kind of played into your Christian faith imagery in that as well. That must have been incredibly unsettling. Not only at the time you were going through it, but that must have been very unsettling afterwards as well, when you look back on it and you examine what actually happened? I mean, how do you square that? Can you square that circle?
Well, it's very difficult, and it was difficult for me afterwards as well, as you say, because I was, hearing from God. I had heard from God callings in my life at different times to do different things, and they had seemed very reasonable, and I had done them, and it worked out. And then I was having this experience of being told that I was, receiving messages from God, and that was not to be believed. So it was very confusing. I kind of think what helped me later was understanding that psychosis doesn't come from nowhere. So your brain doesn't just magic thoughts into existence when you become psychotic. It can only run on the software that's already in your brain. So if you have a lot of thoughts about faith and a lot of thoughts about God, then those are the thoughts that are going to get warped when you have a psychotic episode. So my understanding of that now helps me to process a bit better. But certainly it was very confusing as a Christian at the time in terms of church scenario. So there was an example of one church that I went to where people were very kind, but really felt like this is not for us. You just need to see the professionals, and didn't really want to be involved too much, most of them. And then I had the opposite experience of going to a charismatic church where I told people, and I hadn't had a diagnosis at this time. I was just working towards diagnosis, so I wasn't able to go in and say, I have schizoaffective disorder and this is what's happening to me. I was just going in and saying, I have an evil presence behind my left shoulder. There are these tormentors attacking me. And they were saying there was demonic influence in my life, and I might have a demon at work in my life, and they needed to pray for me in deliverance, and they prayed, and I didn't get better. And then they said to me, well, there must be a block to your deliverance. So are you harboring a secret sin? Do you need to make a confession? So all of this was very, very disorientating to me. And I was being told by the mental health professionals, you have an illness. When I went to church, I was being told there's demonic influences in your life. It was very, very confusing. And that experience of going through deliverance ministry was ultimately very detrimental to me as a person struggling with mental illness. And I think that's somewhere where churches have to be extremely careful, because like you said, I have grown up in a setting where I've been aware of powers and principalities, and those are real, but we need to differentiate that from severe mental illness.
Yeah. And that is, and historically that has been part of the problem, especially for the charismatic wing of the church, that although we may have very clear theology and doctrine around the idea of the demonic and of principalities and powers and of deliverance, there is a need to differentiate between what is a physical illness that is creating problems with psychosis and is impacting your mental health, and what is a spiritual thing. And that discernment isn't always as sharp perhaps as it should be.
No, I think it can be really helpful to involve a Christian mental health professional, a psychiatrist, someone who can offer some insight into the mental health side of it and how it presents. Because, if my illness had been of demonic origin, when I was given antipsychotics, it wouldn't have got better. And I take antipsychotics, and I'm not psychotic, and I'm also not having experiences of evil presences or whatever else. And as I understand it, there's a dopamine imbalance in my brain. That dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and antipsychotics generally work to dampen down dopamine. It's very hard to say so-and-so has got more dopamine in their brain than somebody else, but certainly that's how antipsychotics mostly work, is reducing the amount of dopamine activity. And for me, that has been life-changing.
And how quickly did that change come about when you received your diagnosis, you started taking the medication? How quickly did you reach a point where you were able to look back on what had happened to you and get an understanding of what was actually going on, rather than perhaps the anxiety of some of the messages that you've been given either from people or from your delusions?
Well, not quickly at all. And that's what made it a really, really difficult journey for me. And that when I first tried antipsychotics, the first ones I tried did not work. So that was, the confusion was ongoing. I also really struggled with some of the drugs that were tried with the side effects. Antipsychotics tend to be, especially the newer ones, really quite sedative and demotivating. And I found at one point that I was really only eating and sleeping and having a shower, and that was all I did in the day. And that's not recovery, that's existing, but it's not thriving. And I wasn't really fully free of the psychosis either. And then about 2016, I was in hospital, and the doctors decided to try a drug called clozapine, which is a particularly strong and effective antipsychotic, but it comes with a side effect profile of some problems that have to be managed in hospital, and there's blood test monitoring and so forth. So I was hopeful trying this drug, and the first day I took it, immediately I felt so much calmer. I don't know if that was the antipsychotic effect or the calming effect, but certainly within 24 hours, I felt a lot better. And I thought, this is going to be the answer. And but then within the first week, I had 2 seizures, and it had to be stopped, and I was absolutely devastated. So I spent some time talking with the psychiatrist. We sat down, and I was at a slightly more lucid stage, where I was willing to work with a psychiatrist, and we looked at the drugs that I had taken and the side effects that I had, which ones seemed to work a bit, which ones really didn't work. And based on the fact that the clozapine had been helpful to an extent, he came up with the idea of trying one of the oldest antipsychotics, so a drug called haloperidol. It wouldn't be a first-line antipsychotic now because of the side effects, but for me, that was a drug that has really worked. And 5 years later, I haven't had one episode of psychosis since I've been on it.
Yeah. You're listening to UCB Life Issues. We are talking this week about living with psychosis and the impact of psychosis, where people have severe, enduring mental ill health, and when that manifests with psychotic episodes, either of things like hallucinations or auditory hallucinations or delusions that shape the way a person thinks about their life. And my guest to talk about that this week is Sharon Hastings. And I'm interested in the titles of your book, Sharon, because your first book, published in 2020, is called Wrestling with My Thoughts. Your second book, published this year, is called Tending to My Thoughts, both of them published by IVP. The difference in titles suggests perhaps a change in attitude and perhaps how you feel about what is happening and has happened to you.
Exactly. Well, The Wrestling with My Thoughts was written at a time when I was still really very unwell, still experiencing symptoms of psychosis intermittently, still really struggling with mood, and very profoundly depressed. And I wrote it from that place. And it was really a place of wrestling with my thoughts. A quote is from Psalm 13. And it was really about my coming to terms with my illness and kind of accepting that I wanted to live life as well as I could as a Christian in the midst of that illness. And I found some truths during it. I wrote about the story of how it started at medical school and the things that happened in terms of the diagnostic journey, and the medication and needing that. But I found at the end of it that I was sure that God was good. Life was hard, and God was good. That God was holding on to me, and that He was giving me strength just to get through day to day. And that's where I was at the end of wrestling with my thoughts. Then I got started on some better medication. I encountered hope. I encountered hope initially through an NHS recovery college. So that is a mental health, part of the mental health team, who offer courses in things like making a wellness recovery action plan, which is a tool for improving your mental health, for looking at mindfulness, introducing that into your life, and for managing anxiety better, for using things like techniques drawn from cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy to manage your symptoms better. And I had never really encountered this idea that someone with psychotic illness could recover. And I don't mean recovery in the sense of cure as such, because obviously these are severe and enduring mental illnesses. They are organic, they tend to last, but it's in terms of developing a life that's worth living. And once I caught on to that hope, like, that was amazing to me. This is a possibility for someone who's been ill as long as me. At least people believe that for me. So I started on a better footing with medication, and having had some talking therapy, I really started on a journey, and internally, and with help from others outside, of changing some attitudes and changing expectations and working towards a better future. And it was really my journey of recovery that inspired me to write Tending to My Thoughts. So it's more about that sort of period after I think it took me to write Wrestling with My Thoughts and realize those truths, that God was good, and he helped me, and he given me strength to be a jumping off point then to move to something new for me, which God has had. And, you know, today I do have that life that's worth living. I'm married to Rob. We have a son, and I get to be a mum at last. And I work a little bit part time actually through the NHS Recovery College where I took the courses, and I can write, and I'm part of my church. And although I still have some symptoms and I still live with the side effects of my medications, I would say today that I'm walking in recovery. So Wrestling with My Thoughts, the journey of illness, and tending to my thoughts, the journey of recovery.
And it's important for those around people like yourself, who are living with this condition, recognizing that it can be treated, that the symptoms can be managed, but that there is an impact. I would imagine one of the things that is really important is for the rest of us to understand that living with a severe, enduring mental health issue, living with something that can produce psychosis, actually, that's a very life-limiting and life-changing reality for you. Is that right?
It really is. I mean, if you think about life-limiting, I mean, I'm not sure that too many people are aware of this, but life expectancy for someone like me as a female with schizoaffective disorder is 17 and a half years shorter than someone who does not have a mental illness, and that's for a few reasons. I mean, there is a component to that where people take their lives very sadly, but it's also the cardiac risk, the lung disease risks, even the risk of dying from flu in winter. They're all higher for people with severe mental illness, and no one's fully sure of the factors involved in that, but it's true. And as we've talked about, it can also be life-changing. You're living with symptoms that are very disorientating and frightening, that might make you not want to go out if you're feeling paranoid or you don't want to meet people's eyes. If you're experiencing a lot of a cacophony of voices in your head, then going into public places can be very confusing too.
And even when those symptoms are being managed, even when medication is being effective, and you've touched already on the fact the side effects of medication can be dramatic and in themselves life-limiting and life-affecting. But even when it is a good day, if I can put it like that, there must be for you a degree of anxiety and of, what if tomorrow is not a good day? What if I'm out with family and things start to spiral? Does that sort of fear, is that a permanent companion?
I think for a long time that was my permanent companion, and obviously eventually that has with time that sort of has eased off a bit, because I have got that experience of living a bit longer without those days developing into something worse. Certainly for a few years, even after I got onto the antipsychotic that worked, I would have had a bad day with feeling my mood was low and just thought, this is it, this is the end, I'm going to spiral into the worst part of my psychosis again. And thankfully that hasn't happened, and partly I think that's because of some of the tools that I have learnt through the likes of the Recovery College that allow me to put a bit of a break on and get a bit of perspective. And for me, a lot of that has come about through awareness. So practicing mindful awareness and being allowing time with myself to sit and see, like, where are my thoughts going? What are my emotions like? Are they ebbing and flowing? Is it getting more intense? And just having that wee bit of a sense of control over it. And for me as a Christian, that's done in a place of prayer before God. But I think for a lot of people who live with psychosis, they don't quite get to that place. Sometimes drugs don't work as effectively. Sometimes people live with voices for years and years, for life. It can be very difficult in terms of impacts on relationships, impacts on work opportunities, impacts on even, financially managing money, being able to sustain housing. There are wide-ranging impacts. I was thinking about this recently, and I really have a sense that God has a deep compassion for people with severe mental illness. And I was reading in Matthew, where Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats and his return, and the righteous asking, when did we see you ill? And he says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters, you did for me. Yeah, I think just the fact that these people with psychosis who don't achieve the recovery that I've been able to really are the least. They're so disadvantaged in so many areas of life.
And is there, because I think we assume very often that there is adequate support for people who live with disabilities. And we know that for people who are living with physical disabilities rather than mental illness disability, that there is little effective support. It feels as though the support that there is getting chipped away at every week. Is there adequate support for people like yourself who are just trying to find a level playing field to live your life?
I think there is support out there. I think it might be patchier than we would like it to be. I think there's also a difficulty of, engagement. Some people aren't able, for reasons of their illness, or willing to engage with some of the supports that are there. We do have, some really, really good day centre programs, some really good work rehabilitation programs, and some supported housing. But a lot of people are not in those situations. And I think the church can offer some things that people, are lacking in. The church can't treat psychotic illness and shouldn't try, because medication is needed, professional input is needed. But it can offer things that are really, really beneficial to people with psychosis. They can offer community, they can offer a sense of belonging, and those are really, really important things. And obviously there are other ministries some churches will do, food banks and so forth, which may be relevant as well. But I just think sometimes we aren't aware of those people with psychosis in our churches. I mean, if we think 3% of the population have a psychotic illness, then surely even in a church of 100 people, there are 2 or 3 there on the margins, most likely, who have psychotic illness, and we need to be aware of them and see what we can do to bring them in.
And my experience has been that one of the positives where somebody is in a faith community, in a church community, and they struggle with their control, they struggle with their illness, the patience, the tolerance, the acceptance, the willingness to go the extra mile, the willingness to welcome back when, accusations have been made or delusions have meant that they have railed against those who are actually trying to be supportive. That is a very, because of the nature of church, or of how church should be, that can be a very positive thing in giving a stable, reliable support for people as they are trying to cope with their illness.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I have experiences. I know I have talked in this interview about experiences that have been detrimental to me on the part of the church, but I have also made really big mistakes in the midst of mental illness. I can remember emailing an entire congregation one time because I was disgruntled about something, and it really was very difficult for people. And it's a real testament to their faith and relationship with God and care for me that they were able to get past that, and still many of them show care to me today. And that, it means so much to me to realise that people are so forgiving. So yes, things do happen and things can be said, and a service may be disrupted if somebody is walking about or whatever. But I think that's all really good for churches to look at that. And I think the other thing that gets missed is that people with psychosis can have an awful lot to give. I know people with psychotic illness who are really talented musicians. I know people who have really, really good visual art. It can contribute in that way, and there are people who can teach you. I think we often think psychosis defines people, and actually it's one part of them. It's an illness. But if you have diabetes, you don't say diabetes defines me. There's so much more to people, and they have a lot to give as well.
But it's getting beyond that fear, isn't it? It's getting beyond that ignorance, is getting beyond that. When you sent out that email, those who were able to see it for what it was were able to see beyond it and see you and love you. And I wonder if part of the responsibility within church is for us to talk more openly, not just about the issue, but to talk about the fact that we have people within our congregation who are living with this, the same as we have people within our congregation who have diabetes or arthritis or depression or whatever. We need to actually have these conversations openly and candidly and in a position of, or an environment of love and acceptance.
Yes, well, I really realised this after I wrote Wrestling with My Thoughts, and it came out in 2020, and I was early in my recovery, and I was beginning to be plugged back into church again, but I had a very sort of in and out relationship with church for a few years, and I talked about the book in church. I was given that platform, which was really helpful, and quite a lot of people read the book, and I was just amazed by how many came back to me and said, thank you for helping me understand. I was afraid, I was fearful, and I understand now. And the understanding was what kind of dissipated the fear, but it hit me. People were afraid. They didn't know what to say to me. They didn't know if they should approach me, and that just being able to open the discussion with the book was helpful to them in that church context. And I'm sure, I think, we do, as we talked about before, we hear in sermons about depression, we hear about anxiety, but I've never heard a sermon on psychotic illness, or mentioned. And I think we do need to open the conversation that bit wider and start talking about the people who are on the margins of our churches.
And it is important that we have those conversations, but at the same time, we do need to have them with care, in the same way that we said, about there needs to be care about the way that we talk about deliverance, and we recognise the reality of illness and the difference between the two. We also need to be aware that if people are perhaps struggling with their symptoms, the words we use, well, let me ask you, can the words that we use sometimes make things worse for people if they are on that sort of hinterland of not knowing where their symptoms are going to take them in that moment?
Yeah, I think we do need to be very careful. I think we need to be using the terminology of psychiatry, the hallucinations and delusions, and be careful about saying things like the darkness and things that could be confused with spiritual problems. I think as churches we need to also be talking about our limitations and signposting people to their GP or community mental health team, and not trying to take on responsibility for fixing or curing people.
Can I just take you back to something we said earlier? You talked about hallucinations, you talked about delusions, you talked about auditory hallucinations as well as visual hallucinations, and you talked about the sense of them as well as the actuality of them that you felt, this sort of dark presence by your left shoulder and so on. If someone is in the grip of a delusion, if someone is in the grip of a hallucination, how do you support someone who is in that place? Because there is, and reading the article, when people try to rationalize with you about your delusion, all it did was feed the delusion and the sense of insecurity and the sense that they were against you. How do I engage with someone who is in the grip of a delusion? Because I can't argue them out of it, can I?
No. Well, you need to find something else to latch on to in their lives. I mean, for example, if someone enjoys going out for a run, it's about engaging them and saying, do you want to go for a run? And not arguing with their delusion, but just doing something with them that brings it. Because as I was saying before, there are other aspects of people's personalities and their interests, and they might want to. They might be nervous about going to a knitting group in the library, and maybe they just need someone to go and do that with them, or take them for a coffee and chat about football. There are things. It's about engaging with the person and not engaging with the delusional thought.
You're listening to UCB Life Issues. My guest this week is Sharon Hastings. She has written 2 books around her experience of living with a severe, enduring mental health illness. One is called Wrestling with My Thoughts, published by IVP. Well, actually, they're both published by IVP. And the second one, Tending to My Thoughts, available online and in good Christian bookshops. So we've talked a bit about what it is. We've talked a bit about where psychosis comes from. We've talked a bit about dopamine levels within the brain and how that can impact and so on. And we understand this. And we've also talked about treatment. What is the future for someone like yourself who is living with this reality? Because the nature of the definition, severe, enduring mental ill health, there's no cure, is there, at this stage?
There's no cure. And I have written about that and Tending to My Thoughts. I kind of realised this is not going to be cured, but I think it is possible for most, if not all, to cultivate a life that is still worth living. So I would say today that there are things in my life that are really, really important to me, that I really enjoy and I get fulfillment from. And my faith is really important to me. And the kind of investing in those positive things helps to drown out the negatives. So it's just like to bank up positive experiences as much as possible so that those enduring negative things have less power over me. That was how I kind of came to understand recovery.
What do you mean by bank up those positive things?
So just really invest heavily in them. Like, for example, I enjoy family activities, and I kind of fell out of that a bit when I was really unwell. So it's about thinking a day my husband is free and my son's not at preschool, will we go out and go to an open farm or do something and just create enjoyable, memorable activities that are really positive? And also on a personal level, for me, I love getting exercise, so I spend time doing that, and that gives me endorphins, and I feel better afterwards. And just all of those positive things, and the more I can put into them, and also spending time with God is important to me, then it just means that the things that are still difficult to me are just drowned out a wee bit. They just have less power.
So how does that work then? Because, okay, your family, you have the day, you go out, you're able to do an activity. It's a very positive thing. It leaves positive impressions in your mind. So what are the hard things that ameliorates, that mitigates for you?
Well, so for me, I have been very fortunate in that once I got on that drug I mentioned, haloperidol, which kind of worked for my psychosis, I have not had a psychotic episode in 5 years, but I do struggle with depression. And in 2022 was a really difficult year for me. I just had a very prolonged depression, and it took a long time to come out of. But just doing those small positive things in the day really helped me to feel just a little bit brighter. It meant that that depression had less of a hold on me. I'm not saying it's not easy. It's definitely not easy to do this. And it took others. It's not just about banking up the positive experiences. I think that really helps. I think savouring each moment that is good really helps, because you can transport yourself back into that, even if it's a sunrise that you've seen or a little bird that you've seen hopping about in the garden. It's about small things, but also having some more skills around just understanding emotions and how they ebb and flow, and how no emotion, not even the deepest depression, is going to stay just as intense forever. It's like the tide, they come in and out, and realizing that on my really bad days, being able to go from a place of always thinking on a bad day, here I am, I'm depressed, this is going to be the same thing for the next 3 months, into sort of thinking, well, tomorrow might be a bit better, and here are some things that I might put in my life today to make tomorrow a bit better.
You can't do that on your own, though, can you?
I think you need a lot of support. You can't do it on your own. I mean, I went to courses at the Recovery College through the NHS, and those are free and anybody can take them. And I think nearly every trust in the UK has a Recovery College, and that can be really helpful because it's just a different model of looking at mental illness. They acknowledge completely the place of medication and the place of psychological therapies, but they also teach people practical ways that they can make their lives better, and that was really helpful. But also the support of people in church and family, and I am just blessed that I have been married for 9 years to somebody who sees past the psychosis, the depression, and the mania to me beyond that. And that has been really important for me. But yes, and friends have stuck by me. It's really amazed me the extent to which friends have stuck by me through it and just encouraged me and said, okay, well, what can I do with you today? Or a phone call, and so the church has a lot to offer in this, because not everybody is like me who has a network of connections around them. And if people can build connections with somebody who's got psychotic illness and wants to work towards recovery, I mean, there's a lot that a sort of steady Christian friend or person who gets alongside them, pastoral person, can do in that situation.
And what is it that, because I would imagine that there are times when the fears, the anxieties around this will bubble to the surface, and things like, oh, I'm just a burden to people, or, you know, these people don't want to have to put up with me going on yet again. Those sorts of emotions, I suppose in some ways, emotions that we all might feel when we worry that those who are around us are maybe growing a little weary of us. What is it that your friends, what is it that your husband is able to do to reassure you that their commitment to you is not being undermined by your psychosis, by your illness, by the fact that you are living with these life-limiting realities?
I think it's just that they tell me that they can see me, that they can see potential, that everyone has those difficult days, that this experience of anxiety about your well-being or your mental state is not unique to people with psychotic illness. You know, anybody can have a difficult day, difficult things happen in people's lives and they struggle, and you know, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world, and we have a God who's greater than all of these things. And there were many, especially, you know, I have a 3.5-year-old, and I was not long into recovery when he came along, and I used to be very worried at times that I was going to become more unwell and not be able to look after him. And those were days when I felt really, really anxious, because that was so important to me to be there for him. And again and again, people said to me, look, you're tired, you're probably a bit sleep deprived, and you know, tomorrow could be different. And every time tomorrow was different, I felt better again. And it was just people to be there for me through that and kind of keep speaking the truth to me.
And that consistency. And I suppose that's where we sort of dial back to, what can we as church communities, as families, what can we do to support people and to help the recovery that is, even if a cure isn't possible, recovery is possible. What can we do? That consistency, that long-term commitment, that faithfulness, all those biblical scriptural principles that we roll off our tongue in communion service so easily. But actually, it is the practical application of those things by identifying someone and walking alongside them.
Exactly. I think it's something that is so simple, and yet I think it's really important to people who have severe mental illness or any mental illness, anybody really, not to feel that they're a project. You know, there has to be a sense of giving that person a chance to contribute to the relationship too. I think there has to be an awareness in the person who walks alongside that it may be an up and down journey. There may be times when the person is willing to engage with them and wants to join them at church or at coffee and whatever. And there may be other weeks where they're just not able to. So it's about just that, yes, as you say, that consistency, that just presence. You know, there's a lot to be said for the practice of presence. You know, some days when I was really ill, I didn't want to engage. I wasn't able to engage. I was too flat and too distracted. But it meant so much to me to have someone just sit with me and not talk and not try to make it all better or explain it, you know, what was going to happen next. So you just that practice of presence was really, really key. And I think that's something that any of us can offer.
Undoubtedly, it is the case that living with an illness that produces psychosis has a dramatic impact, even in recovery, has a dramatic impact on the person who is ill, on their life. If we are going to effectively support and care for this 3% of our population who live with this reality, if we're going to show Jesus' love to them, if we're going to show compassion, if we're going to create an environment where they can flourish and they can prosper, and after all, isn't that what the faith community is all about? Creating an environment where we can all flourish and prosper in the way that God intended us to. If we're going to do that, we need to get beyond the stereotypes. We need to get beyond the insecurities. We need to get beyond the fears. We need to get beyond the anxieties as to whether we will be up to the task or not. We need to get beyond the always feeling that we need to provide an answer or explain things away. And we just need to be loving, empathetic, compassionate, respectful, caring friends, brothers and sisters in Christ. Because it seems to me, from reading Sharon's books and looking at some of the articles that she's written, it seems to me that the thing that is most important is that gift of presence, that you will simply turn up, be there, and be what is needed on that day to get through to the next one. Sharon's books are called Wrestling with My Thoughts and Tending to My Thoughts, published by IVP, and I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again, that reading some of her writings are some of the finest, most accessible resources I've found in terms of understanding the reality of living with psychosis. Sharon, thank you for joining us today on Life Issues.
Thank you.
This has been UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. Thank you as well to Rachel, my producer, for keeping everything on the straight and narrow. And why not join us next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da!